It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and this is a quick review of the Gigabyte M27U. There's a link to a more thorough video review as well as a written review in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support. As usual, for a video, what you see depends on my camera, depends on the processing done by my video editing software, depends on the processing done by YouTube, and ultimately, and very importantly, it depends on the screen that you're actually viewing the video on, so it doesn't accurately represent what you'd see firsthand. This monitor uses a 27-inch panel with support for 160Hz refresh rate. It's technically 150Hz with a mild factory overclock which you can apply, and it has a 3840 by 2160, that's 4K UHD resolution. More specifically, it is an AU Optronics AHVA panel. So you've got really good desktop real estate potential. You will be able to see how small my desktop icons are. UI elements and text in general is very small because of this resolution if you're not using scaling. I'm not using any scaling at the moment. I'm actually used to using monitors of this kind of pixel density natively without scaling, so I can benefit from the full desktop real estate. However, you might want to use a bit of scaling. Whether you're using scaling or not, most applications do scale cleanly these days. So if you're using scaling or application-specific zoom, so you just zoom in a bit when you're browsing the internet or doing word processing, then you still benefit from the strong pixel density. Things scale cleanly, things are just larger, but they're still very clear with nice crisp edges. So yes, the overall crispness, the clarity of text is really nice. It also applies to suitably high resolution image content, and that would also apply to games and movies, certainly games. And I explore this a little bit more in the written review in the 4K UHD experience section there. There's also an article on the website exploring the 4K UHD experience on a screen of a similar size to this one. So a few points to note about this monitor. It does have a height adjustable stand. You can also tilt the stand forwards and backwards a little bit, but it doesn't offer further ergonomic flexibility, so you can't swivel it left and right, and you can't pivot it into portrait. There are VESA holes at the back if you want to use them for 100 by 100mm VESA mounting. The monitor includes HDMI 2.1 support, and that will be topping out at 150Hz. If you're using DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, then you can get 160Hz with an integrated overclock feature, and I will be using that in this review. I'm using that now, worked just fine with my RTX 3090. The monitor also includes USB-C. It also has a separate USB Type B port as well as a few Type A ports, and that means it has KVM functionality. It has a little integrated KVM switch, so a little button dedicated to that. You can set it all up, and then when you press that button, it allows you to quickly reassign connected USB peripherals and also switch the display input quickly between two different systems. I'm now in shadow of the Tomb Raider, and I'm going to talk about the contrast performance of the monitor. This monitor has an IPS type panel. As such, contrast isn't its main strength. I recorded around 1000:1 with most settings on the monitor, including my test settings. So that is as specified. It's pretty typical IPS territory. There's also IPS glow to consider. The way I've got the camera mounted at the moment, you might be able to see that a bit towards the top corners as well. It tends to look a bit warmer there, whereas towards the bottom corners it tends to look a bit cooler. You can see this sort of hazing there, which does eat away at the depth and atmosphere a bit and just lightens things up. From an ergonomically correct viewing position, if you want to call it that, you would actually be looking at the monitor a little bit above center. So you'd tend to notice the IPS glow more towards the bottom of the screen than the top. But anyway, the IPS glow here, it's at a typical level for an IPS model of this size. Actually a touch lower than some models I've used recently of this kind of size. But the IPS glow will be increased if you're sitting close to the monitor, if you're using a higher brightness, or if your monitor has significant issues with backlight bleed and clouding. The strength of IPS models like this is the gamma consistency. So yes, there's some detail loss because of the IPS glow, but elsewhere the dark details are well maintained throughout the screen. You don't have the kind of shifts you see on VA or TN models, where you'll see significant shifts in perceived gamma at different points of the screen, which affect the visibility of dark shades. It's much more consistent than that in this case. I've now lightened the room up a bit. It's not a bright room, it's just brighter than it was before. It was pitch black before. And it's just to show you that if you brighten the room up a bit, it does take the edge off that IPS glow, and it just makes the weaknesses and perceived contrast a bit less noticeable. But that's not to say it looks incredible and OLED-like, with amazing depth and inkiness or anything like that. You might be able to see a bit of glare on the screen depending on your lighting as well. The M27U has what I would classify as a light to very light matte anti-glare screen surface. So this means that in terms of glare handling, it's pretty good, but not as strong as some matte screen surfaces. So you can see sharper, sort of glassy looking glare patches when you've got strong direct light striking the screen surface, as I do in this example here. But on the plus side, you don't get as much diffusion of the light, so it doesn't diffuse and haze up the image as much. And the light to very light matte finish also means that there's not as much layering in front of the image, so it improves the clarity and vibrancy potential as well. And with the screen switched on, considering those brighter shades, there's a little bit of graininess. It's not too bad though, it's not a heavy smeary graininess. It's more of what I describe as a sort of a light, misty graininess really. Not too obtrusive, most people are going to be just fine with this. It doesn't have an obvious layered appearance in front of the screen or anything like that. I'm now on Battlefield 2042 and I'm going to talk about the colour reproduction of the monitor. If your monitor has a wider gamut than sRGB, as this one does natively, then that invites extra saturation and vibrancy when viewing content designed with the sRGB colour space, and that includes games like this. If you're just on the desktop, generally you're watching movie content or you're just browsing the internet, a lot of the time the content is designed with the sRGB colour space in mind. Certainly the case under SDR, as I'm running the monitor in now. So with the wider gamut you get extra vibrancy and extra saturation beyond what the developers intend. So I'll just put the colour gamut on the screen. You can see that there is significant extension beyond sRGB. I measured 91% DCI-P3, which actually falls short of the manufacturer's claims of 95%, but either way there's significant extension beyond that. You can see that for some green shades towards the red region. The blue region as well for some shades. There's a little bit of undercoverage actually for some shades. Technically 99% sRGB coverage was recorded in that respect. But overall, yeah, pretty vibrant look to it. Not as extreme as some models with an even more generous gamut, but there's certainly good pop to the fires here, for example. The grass as well, some extra saturation there, bit of extra pop. Doesn't look neon or anything like that, doesn't look cartoonish. Sky blues as well, some extra pop. And because of the quite generous extension in the red region, that does bring out some reddish browns too strongly. So the earth here, for example, doesn't look quite as neutral as it should. You can see that with some skin tones as well in games more generally. It just brought out a bit too strongly. And some people are going to like this look. It's vibrant, but other people might prefer the as the developers intend look within the sRGB colour space and will prefer to clamp the gamut to sRGB. The monitor does have an sRGB emulation mode that achieves exactly that. So you change picture mode to sRGB. You can adjust the brightness in this mode, thankfully, but you can't adjust things like the colour channels or the gamma. I explore this mode more in the written review, but again, there are those restrictions to bear in mind. Another restriction is the fact that it locks the overdrive into the off setting for no apparent reason, which is kind of annoying. If you prefer sRGB emulation without these restrictions, then there are alternatives which are explored in the review if you're a PC user with an AMD or NVIDIA graphics card at least. But yes, things do look more muted now. The monitor also has excellent colour consistency from the IPS type panel, so that means that shades maintain the vibrancy, the richness throughout the screen, not just in the central region of the screen, but when the shades are viewed further out, they look very similar as well. So much better than VA or TN technology in that respect. This is useful for colour critical work, and if you're considering colour critical work or colour accurate work on this monitor, or just work where you really would appreciate good colour accuracy, then be aware that the DCI-P3 coverage, I wouldn't really say it's ideal, certainly not on my unit and what I recorded here, 91% for work within that colour space. I measured 87% Adobe RGB coverage, which isn't good enough for accurate work within that colour space. For sRGB, you've got 99%, so not complete coverage, but to be honest, quite close. It's going to be decent for work within the sRGB colour space, but to be honest, if you want to be working a lot within wider colour gamuts, I would consider an option with a wider gamut than this. I'm now going to talk about the HDR performance of the monitor, and to start off I'm just doing a quick local dimming test. I will link to this in the description of the video. You can see that there are only 8 dimming zones on this monitor. They're running as vertical bands throughout the screen, so very limited precision, but it does mean that some areas of the screen can be bright, others can be dimmer. Of course, real content, it's not going to be just black and white as it is here. There are going to be more complex mixtures of shade. But even if I pause the video and disable the local dimming setting, then you can see a significant difference in the depth of the darker shades. There are 3 different settings for local dimming: low, middle and high. I'd recommend high. I explore this more in the written review and a bit in the longer form video review. And if you're interested in the other settings as well, they're explored in the OSD video and the best settings video. But I'm going to jump into some gameplay now, and just remember that I'm using the high local dimming setting, which I've just turned on again before I forget, and everything else is set to the default under HDR. I'm now on Shadow of the Tomb Raider and I'm running the game under HDR. So you can see there are more complex mixes of shade. Just for reference, by the way, I'm using an RTX 3090 connected by DisplayPort, but I tested with HDMI 2.1 and it's a very similar experience. And a lot of what I'm talking about here is going to apply regardless of what you're using for your HDR, really limited by the hardware on the monitor here. This monitor is VESA Display HDR 600 certified. Part of that is the local dimming solution, which I've shown you. The other thing is that it can reach around 600 nits in brightness, but that really is very much dependent on the content. And if I look here, for example, the brightness there, it's not going to be anywhere near 600 nits anyway because the game's not trying to pump that out, but it does look dimmer than it could, and that's because, remember, the dimming solutions are vertical bands, and also the depth of the dark shades there isn't as good as it could be. I know it's difficult to see this in the video, and I'm sorry about that, but to the eye, there's clearly not as much depth as there could be. Here, there's a mixture of medium and darker shades, and again, the local dimming precision just isn't there to really get the depth that is required here. Although, if there wasn't local dimming, and I'll just turn the local dimming solution off to demonstrate this, then there's a massive uplift in depth, which isn't nice, and things really look extremely flooded. So the local dimming does still help situationally in scenes like this. So I've activated it again with the high setting, and another advantage of HDR is you get 10-bit color processing, so that improves your nuanced shade variety. I talk a bit more about this in the written review and the longer form video review, but basically it does enhance the nuanced shade variety, closer matching dark shades, for example, and a better array of brighter shades. But for this to really work, you do need to have better dimming precision than you have here. Very limited with just 8 dimming zones, not a true HDR experience at all. But as I demonstrated, at least some advantage to having dimming zones in certain scenes. This scene here, really very complex mixtures of darker and brighter and medium shades. So the depth of the shadows around the vegetation there isn't as good as it could be or should be. But still, the local dimming in this scene, for example, the zones there can be brighter than the zones here, so it does still help a bit. And when I'm moving around, generally the dimming zones are pretty reactive, but not so reactive or extreme with their reactions here where I'm really aware of them doing their thing. They just kind of do their thing. So it's a reasonable local dimming algorithm in my opinion as well. Turning the attention now to the brighter shades, the glint of light on the water surface there. Well, it's not particularly eye-catching, not particularly impressive. I measured around 260 nits. You can see the exact figure in the written review, which is nowhere near the maximum that this monitor is capable of. Well, there are two reasons for that. One is that the game's not trying to go for the maximum that the monitor can output, so I'd never expect the maximum brightness to be achieved for this glint because it's not supposed to be that bright, but it is supposed to be more eye-catching than it is here. And also if I turned local dimming off, then it was above 400 nits for this glint. I think it was around 450. Again, refer to the written review for the exact figures. So really, it's being dragged down because of the fact that there are only 8 dimming zones and it has to consider the bright shades there, but the darker shades, which are also covering the zones, so it can't just blast out as much brightness as it ideally would. It did do a bit better in some other scenes, so that the Battlefield 5 sun, the mountain sun, the brightness there was more impressive actually. I think it was above 500 nits. Again, refer to the written review for the exact figures. Just quickly switching attention to the colour side, I'm not going to spend too long on this, but just to give you a reminder on the screen of the colour gamut we're talking about here. This is 91% DCI P3, so that's, it's a reasonable HDR gamut, but ideally you'd have more DCI P3 coverage than that. You'd actually have extension beyond DCI P3, so into Rec 2020. So these are the colour spaces which developers have in mind, so they're not actually targeting sRGB for content under HDR, or they shouldn't be. That means that the colour gamut's put to better use, so you don't get the kind of oversaturation that I had under SDR. So Lara's skin here, it doesn't look overly tanned as it did under SDR. The rocks here, they have this kind of coppery tone under SDR, which is far too strong. Under HDR, that's toned down. The greens here as well, it's a bit yellowish under SDR, that's toned down a bit. Although I would say that just in general, the saturated elements such as the greens here, and if I was looking at fires and things like that, so that the developers want them to be saturated, they're not as saturated as I've seen on monitors with a more generous gamut and also with better dimming precision, which will add some depth to some of these shades. So really on the colour side, the HDR is pretty limited as well. I would say that overall it's better than the most basic HDR performance here. You do get the VESA Display HDR 600 capability, a bit more brightness than some models provide. You do at least get some rudimentary local dimming. and the colour gamut's at least reasonable, better than some models. So it's not terrible under HDR, but it's not something which you're going to want to use all the time. It's more something which you're going to be wanting to use every now and then for a bit of variety. I'm now on Battlefield 5 and I'm going to talk about the responsiveness of the monitor. I've got the game running at 160 frames a second, or very close to that. The monitor is running at 160 Hz, and this is a 160 Hz capable monitor. To get 160 Hz, you do actually need to apply a little overclock. It's called Display Port Refresh Rate, or DP Refresh Rate. It's found in the display section of the OSD. You can set that to 160 Hz. It's set to 150 Hz by default. And the reason for that is that you may get some screen blanking issues or flickering issues, or perhaps out of range issues with 160 Hz. It can depend on your GPU. So for wider compatibility, they set to 150 Hz by default. But if it doesn't work for you or you're getting frequent issues, then just stick to 150 Hz. There's really very little difference between 150 and 160 Hz, 10 Hz. It makes very little difference. But anyway, this 160 Hz performance brings with it two main advantages. One is that it improves the connected feel, significantly so compared to a 60 Hz performance. You get much greater connected feel, and that describes the fluidity and the precision when you're interacting with the game world. Low input lag helps in that respect as well, and this monitor does have low input lag. It's not super low. I measured a bit under 4 milliseconds, but that still indicates a good low signal delay, which most users should be absolutely fine with, and the signal delay is the main element of input lag you feel. The high frame rate, high refresh rate combination also brings with it advantages in terms of reducing perceived blur due to eye movement. So the two main forms of perceived blur. One is due to eye movement, that's closely linked to the refresh rate of the display and frame rate of the content, which we'll have to be keeping up as well. And the other is the pixel responses of the monitor. They're also important. This is all explored in the written review, or summarised in the written review, in an article all about responsiveness on the website if you're interested in more detail. This article also explores a photography technique called pursuit photography, which allows you to capture both elements of perceived blur on a monitor very nicely. So here are some pursuit photographs taken on this monitor at 160 Hz. There are various other refresh rates shown in the written review if you're interested, in some comparisons as well with some of the 28-inch fast IPS 4K UHD models as well. They don't run at 160 Hz, which is why they're not used in the comparison here. But this is good to show the overall performance of this monitor and also the different overdrive settings. So with this, I consider picture quality to be optimal. With balance, it introduces more overshoot, and actually for some transitions beyond what are shown in this particular test, that overshoot is more noticeable. It's quite bright and quite eye-catching in my opinion. So I do prefer the balance of picture quality. But what I would say is that the overall performance here with picture quality is actually pretty good. So the weaknesses, yep, they're on the minor side, a bit of powdery trailing in places, mainly where darker shades are involved, or very bright and saturated shades, sort of the extremes really. There are a few of those in this scene here, but nothing that stands out in an obvious way. So nothing like smeary trailing as you see on VA models, and nothing like the more pronounced powdery trailing, the heavy powdery trailing as I'd call it, that you can see on some IPS models. The powdery trailing here is not that bold, and it sticks closer to the object, so it doesn't stand out in the same way. So it just adds a little bit of perceived blur in places, but again, it's on the minor side. So a good performance. And there's really nothing that stands out in an obvious way in terms of overshoot. Just traces here and there, nothing which you're going to really notice, even if you're actually actively looking for it. With this picture quality setting, I don't think even sensitive users are going to find this problematic. If you're particularly unsensitive to overshoot, you could actually use the balance settings to speed up the pixel responses a little bit. There are still going to be some weaknesses in terms of powdery trailing, and you're going to get an increase in overshoot. But just try the different settings, see which you prefer. This monitor supports VRR, variable refresh rate. You can use HDMI 2.1 VRR, and that means you can also use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode via HDMI. You can also use NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode via DisplayPort using Adaptive Sync. And with Adaptive Sync, you can also use AMD FreeSync Premium Pro as an AMD GPU user or compatible games console user. So lots of options with VRR on this one. I'm using an RTX 3090 at the moment, connected via DisplayPort, but I tested with HDMI 2.1, very similar experience. The variable refresh rate range of this one, it's claimed to be 48 to 160 Hz, and some of the time it was, in my experience, using this monitor. Other times the VRR seemed to go down to 55 Hz rather than 48 Hz, and then switched over to using LFC, low frame rate compensation. It just depends on the fluctuations occurring, but it doesn't really make much of a difference in practice. It's just a little technicality I wanted to mention. When it goes below, say, 55 Hz or 48 Hz, or something between that, depending on when it decides to do this, decides to switch over to using LFC, low frame rate compensation. That's what AMD calls it, but NVIDIA GPUs use a similar technology. Then it sticks to a multiple of the frame rate with its refresh rate, and that keeps tearing and stuttering at bay. So if you're sensitive to tearing, as you get with VSync off and no VRR, or you're sensitive to stuttering, which you can get with VSync on and no VRR, then it can be very nice to have VRR working as it does on this monitor, and there were no particular issues with flickering or additional VRR issues like that. It worked very well with G-Sync compatible, even though it's not officially G-Sync compatible certified. That's really just a process which Gigabyte decided not to go for here. I don't doubt that it would pass NVIDIA's certification. I don't see why it wouldn't if they decided to actually certify it. I've now got the game running at 120 frames a second, the monitor being at 120 Hz. I'm doing this with a frame rate limiter in the game. It's not perfect, frame rate limiters generally aren't, so it's not exactly 120 Hz, which is why I've turned the monitor's little refresh rate display off, because it was fluctuating all over the place. It was actually a bit distracting. But it is more or less 120 Hz. And with this, the monitor still performs well using its picture quality setting. There's a bit of an increase in overshoot, but I don't find it too extreme. So there's a little bit of halo trailing behind the tree there. You're probably not going to be able to see this on the video because it's not extreme by any means. So I would still stick to the picture quality setting. Got the game running at 80 Hz now. Sorry, 80 frames a second. The monitor's running at 80 Hz. And there is a further increase in overshoot. Now, it's perhaps a bit eye-catching, but it's not extreme. If you do find it too eye-catching, you could just turn the overdrive to off. And with that setting, the monitor still performs quite well actually for these kind of refresh rates, these double-digit refresh rates. It keeps up nicely and gives you a decent performance. So if you are sensitive to overshoot and you're spending a lot of time in the double digits, just switch the overdrive off. It still gives you decent performance. 60 Hz, 60 frames a second now. Overshoot is stronger again, somewhat eye-catching. I'd be probably tempted if I was spending a lot of time here to use the off setting, which again works well for these kind of refresh rates where the pixel response requirements aren't as tight as they are at high refresh rates. The off setting is useful at something which are 28-inch alternatives to this, such as the Gigabyte M28U and the Acer and Asus models, which I've reviewed, the VG28UQL1A on the Asus side and the Acer XV282KKV. Don't ask me how I remember those model codes. They had quite a bit of overshoot at lower refresh rates and you couldn't get rid of it. There was no way of getting rid of it regardless of what you did with the overdrive settings. So I do consider the M27U more flexible in that respect. It's something I quite like to see because it is something I criticised the 28-inch models for when I reviewed them. The monitor has a strobe backlight setting, which is explored in the written review. It isn't a particularly good one, although it's not the worst I've seen. It may have some utility for some people, but it isn't something which is useful to explore in the video because all you see is annoying flickering. It's really something that I feel is best in written format, so that's how I'm going to leave it. So overall, I feel this is a good monitor, well-balanced performance and a nice attractive price tag. It's around $500 US, which is a very good price for this monitor. A little bit more, a little bit less, depending on whether you've got it in the sale. It seems to go on sale quite a bit. Either way though, good value for the performance offered here. So, if I'm to criticise or look at the niggles that I have with the monitor, I guess there are a few things which could be improved. The ergonomics aren't amazing, although it does have height adjustment and tilt adjustment. The build quality is quite basic. It doesn't feel super cheap or flimsy or anything like that, but I prefer coated metal stand bases. I often find the stand bases of these Gigabyte monitors a little bit plasticky feeling, to be honest, although they do have a weighted metal backplate so that the monitor doesn't tip over or anything like that. And of course the contrast isn't amazing, although it's in line with specifications and typical for an IPS model. There are some IPS models which are a bit stronger than this, although there are some that are a bit weaker as well. The colour gamut as well, it didn't extend right to wide gamut territory. It's still wide gamut, but it didn't fully cover or come close to fully covering DCI-P3 and certainly not Adobe RGB, but it was still enough to give a vibrant look to things. And for some people, the fact that it's not an extreme gamut will actually help because it doesn't have the same extent of saturation and vibrancy. The HDR performance as well was, limited by the fact it had 8 dimming zones, although it still gives a bit of a boost compared to most HDR monitors, and that's a sad state of affairs, I'm afraid. Most HDR monitors really are very basic, even more basic than what's offered here. You still get some bursts of brightness, some situational boosts in contrast here with the 8 dimming zones and the 600 nit or so peak brightness capability. Very dependent on the content, of course. The sRGB emulation setting as well, I would have liked to see more flexibility. I don't know why they locked the overdrive setting to off, for example. That's a strange thing to have done. Ideally, you'd have control of the colour channels and gamma and things like that as well, but that's not something which is always offered anyway. I think it was well rounded when it came to the responsiveness as well. Decent 160Hz performance with low input lag, good overall pixel responses, and good flexibility with the overdrive settings across a range of refresh rates. I wouldn't really say it's a true single overdrive mode experience, although some people would find that picture quality setting works well throughout the VRR range. And really for me that was kind of a key criticism I had with the 28-inch models I looked at, and this would also apply to the Gigabyte M28U, but not the M27U, which is looked at here, and that's there is no setting which gets rid of overshoot. So if you're sensitive to overshoot, you're a bit stuck with that, and it does get stronger as the refresh rate decreases. So if you're looking to spend sort of around $500 on a 4K UHD monitor, which is capable for a range of uses, and that will include gaming, then I think this is a nice option and one that I can recommend. So that's really all there is to this quick review of the Gigabyte M27U. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. Be aware that liking the video, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, they are nice ways of showing your support.